Hey everybody, I'm Holly, aka the ScientoloGeek. I'm a little under the weather today. Had a COVID booster yesterday, and I guess I'm having mild side effects. Uh, so I'm not going to be showing myself on camera today, but I did figure that we should actually get this thing done. So let us start immediately with departure.
The mental awareness that something is wrong with a scene is the point at which one can begin reverting to the ideal scene. Without this awareness on the part of a group, then an individual can be much impeded in handling a situation. The mental processes of the person seeking to improve things toward an ideal scene or change them back to an ideal scene must include those who are also parts of the scene. Seeing something wrong without seeking to correct it degenerates into mere fault finding and natter. This is about as far as many people go. That something, real or imagined, is wrong with the scene is not an uncommon state of mind. Not knowing what's intended or being done, or the limitations of resource, or the magnitude and complexity of opposition, the armchair critic can be dreadfully unreal. He therefore tends to be suppressed, particularly by reactionaries who try to keep it all as it is regardless.
It almost seems like Hubbard is an armchair critic when it comes to anything he writes, especially talking about psychiatry.
Unfortunately, the continual battle of life then is between the critic and the reactionary. As this often blows up in pointless destruction, it can be seen there could be something wrong with both of them. Particularly, the inactive carping critic is at fault on three counts. A, he isn't doing anything about it. B, he's not conceiving or broadcasting a real ideal scene. And C, he's not providing any gradient approach to actually attain an ideal scene. The reactionary, of course, simply resists any change regardless of who's suffering, providing the reactionary can retain what position and possession he may have.
So the inactive carping critic doesn't do anything about it. Well, I can say that Hubbard is definitely doing something about it, about these non-existent problems. Granted, he is not conceiving or broadcasting a real ideal scene. I mean, his ideal scenes are that his orgs need to be functioning, and he's not providing any gradient approach to actually attain an ideal scene. You can provide a gradient approach. It doesn't mean it's the right one, and it doesn't mean that a gradient approach is the right answer.
A revolutionary, of course, usually one is doing something about it, even if violent, two is conceiving and broadcasting his version of the ideal scene, and three is planning and acting upon some means of bringing about his own ideal scene.
That sounds like Hubbard, actually. Some of his tactics are violent. He's talking about his version of the ideal scene when it comes to psychiatry, and he's acting upon it by doing things like creating CCHR.
History and progress seem to be the revolutionary making his version of progress over the dead bodies of reactionaries.
The only problem with his stuff is that he is not making any progress because critics are clearly pointing out what the problems are, and even just people in the orgs can see what the problems are, but they have to continue with policy, continue with the tech in order to be able to make this go right.
Although it may be history and progress, the cycle is usually intensely destructive and ends up without attaining an ideal scene and also destroying any scene existing. The ancient world is filled with ruins over which one can wander in contemplative and philosophic reverie. These attempts to make and maintain an ideal scene certainly left enough bruised masonry around. So it's really not enough to natter, and it's rather too much to thrust violent change down on the heads of one and all, including the objectors. Violent revolution comes about when the actual ideal scene has not been properly stated, and when it excludes significant parts of the group. It's no good having a revolution if the end product will be a further departure from the ideal scene. The pastoral nonsense of Jean-Jacques Rousseau was about as wide from an ideal scene as you could get, and it and other efforts, also wide, brought on the French Revolution.
So I don't know anything about Jean-Jacques Rousseau or the French Revolution, and I'm not going to give myself a freaking history lesson on this.
The Russian 1917 revolution had already been preceded by the democratic Kerensky revolt, but it failed because Russia, being Russia, was about a century and a half late. Also, the French Revolution was late. And in both cases, those who should have led didn't. Lesser ranks overthrew command. These and countless other human upheavals mark the fluttering pages of history, and history will be written in similar vein again and again to eternity, unless some sense and logic gets into the scene.
As long as it's not Hubbard's logic. Revolt is only an expression of too long unmended departures from the ideal scene of society. Usually the stitches taken to mend the growing social order are too weak and too hastily improvised to prevent the cultural fabric from being torn to rags. I don't know, it seems like we've done a pretty good job to prevent our cultural fabric from being torn.
Street battles and angry infantry are the direct opposite of the ideal political scene. What was needed in such a case was an awareness of departure from the ideal scene, the discovery of why a departure occurred, and a gradient, real and determined program to return the scene closer to the ideal. The elements of improved mechanical arts and progress in the humanities may be utilized to effect the recovery. In any event which is missed by the reactionary in his good old days, cultures do change, and those changes are a part of any new ideal scene. So one does not achieve a reversion to the ideal by turning back the clock. One must be bright enough to include improvements in a new ideal scene.
Yes, one must be bright enough to overwrite the tech, override it, and override policy to be able to actually bring improvements to a new ideal scene. This isn't 1975 anymore, Hubbard. This isn't 1960. This isn't 1950. Your ideas about society are very clearly those of reactionaries who thinks that they need to stick to this one thing and not change a single thing about it, which has helped to lead Scientology down the absolute shitter. Let's see how long we got left on this. Alright, so we'll do ideal scene and purpose and then end off.
Let us look this over, this concept of the ideal scene, and see that it's not a very complex thing. One doesn't have to be much of an expert to see what an ideal scene would be. The complex parts of the whole may not make up the whole, but they are not really vital to conceiving an ideal scene for any activity as small as a family or as big as a planet. The entire concept of an ideal scene for any activity is really a clean statement of its purpose. All one has to ask is, what's the purpose of this? And one will be able to work out what the ideal scene of this is. To give a pedestrian example, let's take a shoe shop. Its purpose is obviously to sell or provide people with shoes. The ideal scene is almost as simple as, this activity sells or provides people with shoes. Now, no matter how complex may be the business or economics of shoe sales, the fact remains that is almost the ideal scene. Only one factor is now missing: time. The complete ideal scene of the shoe shop is then, this activity is intended to provide people with shoes for time. It can be always, or for its owner's lifetime, or for the duration of the owner's stay in the town, or the duration of the state fair. Now we can see departures from the ideal scene of this shoe store. One is to work out fairly correctly what the purpose of an activity is, and how long it is to endure before one can make a statement of the ideal scene. From this, one can work out the complexities which compose the activity in order to establish it in the first place, including the speed of the gradient, how much shoe store, how fast, and also how to spot the fact of departure from the ideal scene. This process would also work on any portion of the shoe store if the main ideal is also not violated. The children's department, the cashier, the stock clerk also have their sub-ideal scenes, and departures from their ideal scenes can be noted. It doesn't matter what the activity is, large or small, romantic or humdrum, its ideal scene and its sub-ideal scenes are arrived at in the same way.
Now, again, I do agree that in order to figure out why something's failing, you do need to know what it should be doing, but this whole thing just seems like more repetition. You may be a revolutionary, but it doesn't mean you're a good revolutionary. You may be a reactionary, like Hubbard and the church, and be so stuck in your ways that you can't change a thing, otherwise it's a high crime. Let's see how much we got left. Actually, methods of awareness, the why. Alright, so we got 3 pages left. We'll cover that in the next episode, so that'll be the last one before we move on to the next policy letter. I want to thank all you guys for listening, and I guess just like if you like the video, dislike if you don't. Comment with your feedback or questions, good, bad, or sideways. and subscribe to be kept up to date on future content. I'll be putting the link to the ScientoloGeek Discord in the description, and I will also be putting in the link to the ScientoloGeek email address if any of you guys want to write me with any questions or anything like that. So, I'll talk to all of you later. See ya.